There are two undeniable characteristics of a terrorist state: killing and kidnapping children. Russia does both. Even on International Children's Day, Russia killed a child in Kyiv. Before invading, Russia prepared a disinformation campaign to justify kidnapping and deporting Ukrainian children to Russia. This says a lot about what this war is actually about. This is genocide, according to Article 2E of the 1948 Genocide Convention, and it's why the West needs to arm Ukraine to win the war and bring prosecutions against the war criminals. Ukraine needs to have the military power and ability to project power enough to enable it to bring back all its kidnapped children from the occupying state. Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. If you enjoy the material we create, then please like and subscribe to help find other fantastic speakers. And of course, do please consider becoming a patron. Yuriy Sak is an advisor to the Minister of Defense of Ukraine. He is also a partner at strategic communications firm CFC Big Ideas. He has a master's degree in international law and legal studies from the Ukrainian Institute of International Affairs and a Study and Research Diploma in Public International Law from the University of Oxford. Well, Yuriy, thank you for joining me, and especially after an intense night of missile and drone attacks in Kyiv.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's an honor and pleasure.
Well, let's jump into probably what is one of the most important topics and something you have written a lot about and done interviews about, and that is the F-16s. Now, you've been advocating for these to be delivered to Ukraine right from the start of the conflict. I think you have realized the absolute importance of F-16s in victory. So could you describe to me, what is it that Ukraine needs? And obviously you needed it a long time ago, but when are these finally going to arrive?
Jonathan, let's start by going back to February 24th of 2022, which is when this large-scale invasion began. And we were then at a point where we knew that our Air Force is based on old Soviet-era style MiGs and Sukhoi fighter jets. And we knew that in order to be able to resist this enemy, and in order to be able to win, and in order to be able to long-term ensure the security of the European continent, because this is something we stress all the time. We are now fighting on the Ukrainian soil, but not just for the Ukraine's future. We're fighting for all of our futures. And we knew that we will have to transform our armed forces towards or in line with Western standards, in line with NATO standards. And, relying on old Soviet-style MiGs, but, I speak to our Ukrainian pilots who are active duty pilots who go on sorties every day. So we speak regularly, and they tell me that, it feels like almost going on a suicide mission when you are in an old Soviet-style MiG and you are standing up against even Russian MiGs, because, if you compare, you would think that these are the same platforms, right? MiG-29 on our side, MiG-29 on their side, but they have refurbished their aircraft. They have equipped them with more modern avionics, with far-ranging radars, with better missiles. So we knew from the start, from our pilots, who, as you remember, during the first days of the war, they were doing legendary work. There were even urban myths being created about the ghosts of Kyiv, who were like shooting down these missiles and who were actually denying Russians air superiority in the skies above Kyiv and above other Ukrainian cities. So our pilots did absolutely heroic and amazing job during the first weeks of this war, using and relying on what they had. But, as soon as we were able to start these conversations, they were telling us that, listen, we will not last like that for long. So let's start talking to our allies about upgrading our fleet, upgrading our Air Force. And of course, we were then at a point where our allies were reluctant even to provide us with heavy artillery, let alone fighter jets. We've come a long way since then. But in April 2022, when we said, for example, to our allies, that we need multi-launch rocket systems, they said it's impossible because it will lead to escalation. It will lead to the nuclear obliteration by nuclear powers of each other, because Russia will strike first. So that's where we were when the discussion about F-16s began. We were like just dreaming about them, and actually we have a little cast model of F-16 which we made in, if I'm not mistaken, end of April. And it's a Ukrainian, it's a model of F-16 done in the Ukrainian colors, right? So it looks like a Ukrainian F-16. And on the little pedestal, I'll actually send you a photograph of this thing, and you can share it with your listeners on your social media. There is a saying, "I have a dream." So we began with this dream of improving our air capabilities by receiving modern fighter jets. Then there was a long discussion of what kind of platforms. At some point, there was talk about the A-10s from the US, because A-10s are, they're not fighter jets, they are platforms that are used to destroy ground forces of the enemy. They did outstanding job in, for example, in Operation Desert Storm. But our pilots, when that talk began, they told us that, look, A-10s are really powerful when it comes to their weaponry, but they are slow and they are easily destroyed by the enemy's air defense. So in order to use A-10s, you need to suppress the enemy's air defenses first, because otherwise you will just be, they will be shot down on their first sorties. So an expert group, not even one expert, a couple of expert groups were created early summer 2022, and the internal discussion began. So what kind of aircraft do we need? What kind of military objectives are our Air Force guys facing, and what kind of aircraft will be most suitable? And I will fast forward now to where we are at the moment. And the decision was reached that, of course, F-16s are the most versatile multi-role platform that allows it's like a three-pronged military objective. So it allows to deal with the enemy's air power in the air. It allows because it has sufficient weapons to provide cover for the ground forces, and it allows, of course, to deal with the cruise missiles, with the drones, and which means it complements the air defense system of a country, Ukraine in our instance. So that's, and then the President Zelensky went to the United Kingdom and delivered his famous Wings of Freedom speech in the UK Parliament. And then all of us who are on the communications side, we started talking about this very, very actively. And here we are now. From being a dream, F-16s have almost become a reality now, because the training will begin soon. We have a strong coalition of our partners in Europe, and now even in the US is on board, who have expressed commitment to, continue with this program, to continue with the fighter jet coalition, train our pilots, provide us with F-16s. And from where we see it, like, we train very fast on everything, right? And our pilots are really capable, and they have so much combat experience, battle experience, that the training program for our pilots can be reduced if you compare it with, with the standard kind of timeline of training a pilot. But of course, it's still not a matter of weeks; it's a matter of a couple of months. But if things begin to happen quick now, if they're streamlined on all ends, in autumn, late September, early October, we could see first F-16s in the Ukrainian skies protecting our cities and our people. And I would like to say another very important thing is, we, in addition to being in a war on the battlefield, in a kinetic war, the so-called kinetic war. So we're also fighting a war of narratives. Now, Russia's main narrative has been, Ukraine will never win this war. It is impossible for a country of the size of Ukraine, the country which is like smaller in every different aspect, to beat a country like Russia. Now, in order for this narrative, for this Russian narrative, and trust me, it does have sympathy in some parts of the world. Like Global South is fully kind of accepting this narrative. That, you know, how can I give interviews every day. Yesterday I spoke with Al Jazeera, with Al Ghad, with Al Arabiya, and they all have this question. I mean, they ask us, what makes you so confident that you can win this war? So we understand that they are very receptive to that Russian narrative. So when our allies tell us that they will send us F-16s, that narrative suffers and is damaged almost irreparably. Because you know, if you have a plot of land and somebody tells you, I'm going to put up a tent there, and you're trying to sell that plot of land to somebody else, to a client, so you tell the client, listen, they've just put up a tent, it's a temporary thing, so that tent will be blown away by wind or whatever, and I will be able to sell you that land. But if that person, instead of a tent, is telling you that I will build, you know, a full-blown brick house on this plot of land, then your client, in this case, for example, Global South, is saying Russia, so you were telling us that the West will get tired. You were telling us that this support will wane and dwindle and decrease. But look, they've now just said that they will give Ukraine F-16s. That's a long-term commitment. That means that at least for another 12 months, they will stand with Ukraine. And that's when we begin to win the war of narratives as well. So the mission that the F-16s will play is twofold. They will considerably improve our Air Force capability, but they will also help us defeat that malign narrative, according to which the West, by supporting Ukraine, is only prolonging Ukraine's suffering, because the end game, the end result is inevitable. Ukraine will lose. No, we know for now, you know, I was at a conference just actually 2 days ago, and I began by saying that nobody, not in Kyiv, not beyond, knows when this war will end. But almost everybody by now understands and knows very well how it will end. It will end with Ukraine's victory on the battlefield. It will end with the setting up of an international tribunal to try war criminals from the Kremlin. And it will end in the long process of Russia paying reparations to Ukraine. And after that, there will come healing and the war will be safe again.
And there's so many questions that come out of that, but these narratives, these propaganda narratives, I mean, I even hear journalists on Times Radio, which I know you've appeared on, I hear journalists on the BBC continue to ask that question. Well, Ukraine's doing well, you know, we are Ukraine, blah, 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 but they cannot win against a larger power. These narratives ignore history. You know, the USSR was beaten in Afghanistan. The US was beaten in Afghanistan and Vietnam. The Soviet Union was beaten by tiny Finland. There are plenty of examples, even of the players we're talking about here, that have been comprehensively pushed back by small, determined nations. And it has to be said, nations that have a more sophisticated sense of self and identity and are willing to fight for that. And of course, Ukraine fits into that category.
Yeah.
Now, pilots, you mentioned that, you know, flying in the MiGs and Sukhois, it feels like a suicide mission. But pilots are not like infantry. You can train infantry up in a number of months. People potentially with no background in the military at all can still get trained up. But pilots, you know, you may be able to get them onto F-16s in the space of a couple of months. But that is off the basis of years of training in you know, various machines, tactics, and so on. You cannot afford to lose pilots, because within the window the victory needs to be achieved, it's very difficult to train up new pilots, isn't it, from scratch?
Well, yes, but you know, we have sufficient number of pilots for the amount of aircraft that we are requesting. We have pilots and doubles, so there is sufficient number of those who have been trained, because you know, for a while it was a very interesting situation. So we have the pilot schools, if you like, and we have lots of pilots who were trained to be pilots, but the amount of aircraft was not sufficient. So we have this disproportion, right? So we have more pilots than we have aircraft. And I know from our pilots, then, like this is how it is. Like sometimes, there are 4 pilots and they are sitting there in line waiting for their turn to go on a sortie, simply because there's insufficient number of aircraft. And these are all already in Ukraine, already well trained, and all they will need to be trained in is how to use, for example, F-16s when it comes to weapon systems, and how to use combined armed operations. How do they interact with other units on the ground, with air defense? But when it comes to the aerial tactics of aerial fights, when it comes to the basics of the pilot training, they are all prepared. That's one thing. But of course, there's probably, we can say, another category of pilots, the future pilots. Now, with those, we can take time, and so we need to separate the 2 groups, the immediate group and the kind of mid-term, long-term group of pilots who need to be trained. And I think the programs will have to be adapted. So the first group, like for example, this is an interesting discussion I had with one of our pilots. He said to me when we were discussing how much time will it be necessary for them to train, and he tells me that, look, ordinarily in any pilot school anywhere in the world, the training program consists of certain blocks. So block number 1 is just for example is air to ground engagement, right? So they spend, like, say, 3 months just learning how to do that type of mission. Block number 2 is when they focus solely on air to air missions, right? Block number 3 is when they focus on engaging with aerial objects and cruise missiles and stuff like that. So what our pilots are telling is that in our case, to save time, we can select this group of pilots who will be trained just to do the air to air missions. This group of pilots that will undergo the training only for ground operations covering missions, and another group. Do you understand? So we can immediately reduce the time 3-fold. Of course, in the future, they will all have to be trained to become universal. But at the same time, to save time and to get these pilots on F-16s and quickly into the air as soon as possible, this can be done that way as well.
Now, at the moment, it is speculated that we're seeing shaping operations ahead of the sort of spring-summer offensive. And without asking you to sort of confirm or deny that, will the delivery of F-16s in some way sort of delay the scaling up of the counteroffensive? Are you going to have to wait for the delivery of this equipment in order to really push the Russians back? Or are there things that can be achieved now? And when we see very effective sort of psychological operations, we'll come on in a minute, which is the drone attacks. But I mean, it's important for Ukraine to have visible victories to keep allies on side as well.
Well, absolutely. And this is why we understand very well that, we will not wait for the F-16s to arrive. And at the same time, we understand that when they will arrive, they will, of course, have an impact. But F-16s are not a silver bullet, so that you understand. And we are conscious of that. We talk about them all the time, but at the same time, it's not a magic wand that, once we have it in our hands, will end the war. But it will, an important elements within our kind of armed forces and within our transformation towards NATO standards. So that's one thing, right? The counteroffensive or the offensive, because we're now in June, and of course that's probably the most frequently asked questions. When is this going to begin? Now, and we understand how important it is for allies to see their assistance work on the battlefield and work successfully. At the same time, our priority concern is always the life of our personnel. So every military operations is planned with this consideration in mind primarily, right? How do we achieve maximum result with minimum losses? Because it is a war and we still incur losses, But by fighting a smart war, we minimize our losses. So there have been a couple of factors which were objective, like weather conditions, right? So a counteroffensive or offensive operations, they cannot actually be carried out successfully if it's muddy, if you're not able to use the tracks-based equipment like tanks, armored vehicles, personnel carriers, and stuff like that, right? So that was one thing. Then, so we're not. It's not a show. You know, sometimes it almost feels like counteroffensive is a show that has been announced to the Western audiences, and everybody bought tickets, and now everybody's sitting in the audience with their popcorn and getting a bit frustrated that it's been such a long time that, you know, we've purchased tickets, give us the show, where is it? It's not like that. We understand that, but we are fighting a war of survival. We are not in the show business, right? So from this perspective, we trust our military command. So far, they've been, you know, every decision that they've made has proven, with hindsight, you know, look at Kharkiv counteroffensive, look at how Kherson was liberated. Of course, there have been certain things that haven't worked according to plan, but by and large, you know, the big things have always been done properly. And this is how we're confident it will happen this time as well. Our president a few days ago said that the time has been set now, so we'll just have to be a little bit more patient and wait for the next steps of the Ukrainian armed forces.
And this is why the so-called psychological operations are, I think, so intelligent and so effective. Everyone's sitting here with their popcorn, waiting for those sort of TV moments. That's not just the Western media. I think in Russia, they are also waiting to see that, even though they may expect a different outcome from it. And even though Ukraine denies any involvement in these, we see insurgent attacks in Belgorod and Kursk region, and you know, a variety of villages along the border of Russian units, so-called Russian opposition, you know, having incursions deep into Russia. We also see the drone attack on the Kremlin, which again, I realize, you know, your government denies, and the drone attack on Moscow. Now, these things are extraordinarily effective. They fulfill that box of popcorn moments, giving people extraordinary entertainment, but also they seem to have a deep psychological impact on the Russian public and on the Russian elite in a way that nothing in this war yet has actually penetrated through. Suddenly, for Russians, this war is something that's not just on their TV screens. It's something that is flying over their heads in reality.
Well, yes, indeed. And, you know, I've already said that it's, in addition to being a war on the battlefield, it's a war of narratives. It's a war of determinations. Now, we have on the battlefield, we have been able to degrade the Russian army severely. You know, they've suffered huge losses. You know, on a daily basis right now, they're suffering, on average, 500 people are killed in action, so 500 soldiers, right? We have seen in the last couple of days that even
that's daily, is it? That's the daily total.
Daily, that's a daily result, you know. So by now, I think very soon we will reach the figure 210,000 Russian soldiers killed in Ukraine on the battlefield. So for the armed forces, for the Russian armed forces, this is something that, and we get the intercepts of their calls to their wives and their friends, and we understand that they are very, very demoralized by, you know, because essentially this is how it works. So the new batch of freshly mobilized and freshly trained recruits arrive on the battlefield, and they are sent to these positions, but they are already wave number 3. And as they go to the battlefield, they see that the first 2 waves didn't make it back, and they see them lying in trenches, dead. And that message spreads. So there is a high degree of demoralization within the ranks of the Russian army, because they see that, you know, they cannot be lied to. Unlike Russians inside Russia, these guys, they see death every day on the battlefield. So they're not buying that propaganda that is fed to the Russians through their federal TV channels. Now, when it comes to the actual Russians inside Russia, you know, honestly, we thought that, well, first, like I said, we thought that when ordinary Russians, when they see that their regime, their terrorist regime, is destroying Ukrainian cities, killing Ukrainian children, raping Ukraine, so is turning into pretty much a Nazi regime and committing all the same types of atrocities, you know, we harbored this hope that this will be a wake-up call for ordinary Russians, and they will pour out into the streets and they will start protesting, you know, stop the war, stop the aggression. Now, this didn't happen. And that's another topic for, I think, many PhDs in human psychology that will have to be examined and studied in the future. But when that didn't happen, we thought, well, okay, so that didn't work. Now we will start killing Russians en masse, Russian soldiers. So when they hear the figures, when they realize how many of their countrymen are being killed on a daily basis, that will make them, you know, realize that something's not going right and they have to somehow begin to protest inside Russia. Now that didn't work because, you know, we see that these figures, you know, we're living in the era of internet. It's very difficult to hide information. So that information makes it through different channels to the Russian information space, but nothing happens. So what is happening right now is the next level, which is, you know, from where we see it, Russian citizens, who some of them actually have been members of the International Legion here fighting with Ukraine against Russia. So they have now splintered off and they have decided why? Because they see the success of the Ukrainian armed forces on the battlefield. They can see that Russia can be beaten, you know, like, so for now, or rather by now, it is apparent for them that a rebellion, an uprising, is not a suicide mission. If you do it smart, you can achieve success. So our success on the battlefield inspires and encourages them, gives them confidence that, you know, Russia is a paper tiger. It's not what it wants everybody to believe it is. And that's why they've become more active. And that's why we see drones in Moscow. That's why we see military operations in Belgorod. And this is pretty much a beginning. This is their own words. You know, I'm just reciting what they've been saying for the last couple of weeks openly. It's the beginning of the civil war in Russia. And so as far as we are concerned, you know, as long as it helps Ukraine end the war in this way or the other, it works for us.
And of course, the other effect of it, we'll come to the psychological effect in a minute, because I think that is incredibly interesting. But the other effect, of course, is that you've talked about Ukrainian operations having as their primary objective preservation of Ukrainian life with the maximum impact possible. Well, if these operations on Russian soil scale up, and they continue to have the kind of plausible deniability which you're able to do. I mean, you're taking the Russian tactic of little green men and you're turning it into little blue and yellow men equally effectively, in fact, more effectively than the Russians seem to be able to do.
Jonathan, I would like to, sorry for interrupting, but I would like to tell you that, like, these guys, what are they called? The volunteers, Russian Volunteers Corps, and the Liberty Battalion. I forget the exact name. They are Russian citizens. They are Russian partisans. They are not. They're not little green men, because little green men in Crimea, they were actually Russian regular armed forces who were dressed and they just took off their insignia, and, you know, Russian leadership was very coy and kind of funny about this, right? So these are little green men. We don't know who they are. and they got their weapons in the military store, ordinary military store. So this is not the exact same situation, because these guys, they are capturing, for example, weapons. Where do they get the weapons? They capture them from Russians. You know, the unfortunate cases sometimes are that, and we've had them during the last week. So in some cases, Russians have captured some of our equipment, and then these guys captured it from Russians. So technically, the Western supplied weapons end up in Russia, and that's something that, you know, the Western partners don't like very much. But look, this is not our responsibility, because, you know, it's a war. So some of the equipment that we receive gets captured on the battlefield for objective reasons. But I would just
and then
like
they
to
use it for propaganda, of course. You know, we saw a propaganda shot earlier in the week, clearly staged with these weapons and vehicles, but they weren't really in a kind of natural pose. That equipment had been used for a propaganda shot.
Yeah. So I just wanted to stress that this is not Ukrainian armed forces dressed as Russian partisans. These are Russian partisans, and that's
they
why
are definitely yeah. I mean, anyone who speaks Russian and listens to them talking, you know, they absolutely have the manner of Russians. They have the Russian language. They don't have Ukrainian accents in any way, and even the way they stand, they move, articulate. They are clearly Russians. But the effect, however, is very beneficial to Ukraine, and that is the more of these insurgency operations that take place, the preservation of Ukrainian equipment and lives when the counteroffensive does come will be so much greater.
Well, absolutely, because one practical outcome of these operations by these partisans is that Russian military leadership has to now think about how to secure borders, you know, where they are now easily penetrated by these partisans. And they have to, I assume, relocate certain, you know, groups, battalions, to calm down the Russians, who are now beginning to question, you know, because the way it works with the Russians, right? They have signed the hypothetical social agreement with the regime. They said, okay, we give up our freedoms, you can have them, but in return, you give us stability and you give us protection. So at the moment, the way it looks, the Kremlin is failing to deliver on their part of the agreement. So they've got the liberties, but they are unable to provide protection and security. So and this is beginning to cause, you know, this is beginning to, at least to make Russians think, you know, so what is happening? What's happening with our deal? And this means that Russians will have to refocus certain of their activities. And of course, the more they're focused on what happens inside Russia, the less capabilities they have on the front lines, the better it is for us.
And there's another interesting effect, and I think this is going to be the last area, because I think it's a very stark contrast between Russian mentality and Ukrainian. So when Bucha and Irpin were attacked and liberated, I heard nothing but sympathy from other Ukrainians. Even though these are wealthy suburbs of Kyiv, everybody is completely sympathetic to the victims in these areas. Whereas the drone attack is on a region of Moscow called Rublyovka, where the military elite, the administrative elite live. And what you now have is Solovyov berating people, saying, well, have some sympathy for these. These are Russians. These are our people. And you have Z patriots, you have so-called liberals, you have people celebrating the bombing of their own elites. What it reveals is they loathe each other. They loathe the people that rule them. They loathe the vertical architecture of apparatchiks who steal all their money. And this operation, denied by Ukraine, has very effectively shown the deep divisions within Russian society. It's even questioned whether there is such a thing as Russian society at all.
So let's, I mean, that's a very interesting point that you're bringing up now, because let's go back to history. And we've said it at the beginning of our conversation today, that the whole, this whole aggression, this whole war, and not just the one that started in February 2022, but 2014, essentially, right, with the illegal annexation of Crimea. It is based on a fake version of history, but that fake version of history kind of triggers in the mind of ordinary Russians, triggers this, I have to fight for Mother Russia because Mother Russia is under threat, and it's actually honorable to die for Mother Russia because Mother Russia gave me everything, you know, everything I have, I owe to Mother Russia. So the Kremlin's kind of psychological objective was to put the Russian people into this Second World War or the Great Patriotic War mindset. What is happening right now is that Russian mindset, having stayed in that mindset for a little while, is now traveling back in time in history and moving to the revolution, 1917 revolution mind frame, where they, look, Russians have historically hated their elites. They have had a number of revolutions. They have killed the Tsar, the whole family. They've shot them and they've poured acid over them so that their remains will not be identified. So this, I think, you know, Russian regime is turning into the evil, which is beginning to be recognizable even by its own people. And it's interesting to see how Russians will, you know, as far as we're concerned, we hope it will happen sooner rather than later. But from the great patriotic mindset, they will move towards let's fight against the Tsar mindset. And this will, of course, help us win this war faster, because the more they are having to deal with this internally, you know, the faster we will be able to kick them out of our land.
And that's my last question here, because we focused on victory, we focused on how to achieve victory, but there are other reasons why victory is absolutely essential. One of those is, of course, to return the kidnapped Ukrainian children, of which there are supposedly around 12,000 still unaccounted for. And also, minds are now turning to reconstruction, to Ukraine being a key part of NATO and the EU. That means victory is almost a prerequisite, I think, for those things to happen. But also, minds are now turning to things like a sort of Nuremberg trial, a tribunal for war criminals, victory. All these things that must follow on are all dependent in a way on a decisive Ukrainian victory.
Well, absolutely. And as an international community, we have been already in a situation where we have said never again. We have been in a situation where we were able to come together and set up, you refer to it, the Nuremberg tribunal, and bring to account those responsible for these atrocities. Yet after that, 50 years on, we had the special tribunal for the crimes committed in former Yugoslavia. We had, as an international community, to set up a similar special tribunal for the genocide in Rwanda. So while we definitely are committed, and we will insist and we will succeed in creating the international tribunal for prosecuting war crimes committed by the Russian regime in Ukraine, it almost seems like as humanity, we're not learning from history. So we will, but at the same time, we know all very well that an evil unpunished comes back and strikes back. This is exactly why we said that, look, in 2014, when Russia illegally annexed Crimea, this was already a grave violation of the UN Charter. This was a crime that should have then triggered a very, very strong response from the international community. This was a moment when the international community already was facing a challenge. You know, are we going to uphold the rules-based order, or are we going to turn a blind eye and just stand by and watch what happens next? We saw that that strategy didn't work. Appeasing the aggressor or trying to ignore, turning a blind eye to these grave violations of international law, they resulted in a much larger tragedy, which is what we're dealing with right now. So we are, there is a group already of over 30 countries who have made a commitment to set up this international tribunal. It still is a question, exactly what kind of tribunal it will have to be, because, for example, there is an International Criminal Court in Rome, but, for that court to actually deal with even the crime of aggression that Russia has committed, countries have to be signatories, right? The jurisdiction of that court is limited because it's a treaty-based court, right? That's the difference between international courts and the ones that we have in our domestic jurisdictions. But a special tribunal, if and when it is set up, will most probably have wider jurisdiction and more powers. So, of course, this will have to be part of the reconstruction and post-war rebuilding effort. And, we are doing everything we can already to make sure that, when the time comes, we're ready. We're collecting evidence. We are documenting all the atrocities. There are certain parts of Ukraine, of course, where we don't have access yet. Like, for example, Mariupol. There are mass graves in Mariupol, and these will also have to be dealt with by an international tribunal, but we don't have access to those. That's why, when we liberate them, I think we will be in for another, I'm afraid, shock, because, there are so many more Buchas ahead of us that we will discover and we will have to deal with. But that's the only possible path that we can walk on, the path of justice. Because in addition to beating the enemy on the battlefield, justice is something that we expect. Justice is something that our allies expect. We need to, again, set a precedent that will, for at least foreseeable future, allow us as an international community to live in peace and stability.
And of course, Russia must not be allowed back into the international community, allowed to trade as it did previously, until these tribunals will fulfill their mission and the criminals have been handed over. Well, the work you're doing is incredible. I know you have to dash off now. It's been a huge privilege speaking to you. Obviously, many people watching this channel are hoping for a victory and are sort of, with you on that, and also agitating for these F-16s to be delivered faster as well. But Yuriy, I wanted to say thank you so much. And of course, Slava Ukraini.
Thank you, Jonathan. And before I switch off, I would like to, of course, express our endless gratitude to the people of the United Kingdom, to the government of the United Kingdom, to the Minister of Defense, Ben Wallace of the United Kingdom, because quite honestly, we were surprised, and we continue to be so encouraged by the amount of support that we receive from the United Kingdom. And we're not just talking about the, number of ammunitions or weapons or tanks, Challenger tanks. We are talking about the way the British people feel about this war, and I think that there's a very good reason for that, because if we again go back in history and we see how Britain was a decisive force when it came to defeating the Nazi regime in the Second World War, I think when this large-scale invasion broke out, generations of British people immediately recognized what Ukraine was faced with. So the people of the United Kingdom, and I mean United Kingdom, England, Scotland, Wales, everybody who contributed back then in making sure that Europe survived. When Russia invaded Ukraine, I think immediately you saw the images of bombings in London. You saw the images of everything that happened during the Second World War. And we feel like you're our brothers and sisters, and I mean it. And it means a lot to us to have you as one of our major allies. And this, having allies like you guys is another reason why Russians understand that they will never win. And that's why Russians understand that Ukraine will win inevitably.
Exactly. Images of people sheltering the metro brings everything back, iconic images of Britain in World War II, as well, of course, all the Russian attacks on British soil, Litvinenko, Skripal. We recall all the things that Russia's done over the years. Well, we wish you a speedy victory and strength, and we're confident in your victory.
Thank you. Slava Ukraini, and stand with Ukraine.